In the early morning of June 8, 793, Bishop Higbald of Lindisfarne stood in the courtyard of his monastery, watching the mist roll across the cold waters of the North Sea. Around him, the stone walls of the church of Saint Cuthbert rose against the grey sky, their ancient carvings worn smooth by decades of salt wind. The only sounds were the crash of waves against the rocky shore and the distant call of seabirds. He did not know that in the next few hours, ships would appear on the horizon, and that what followed would send shockwaves through all of Christian Europe, marking the beginning of a new age of terror. He was the Bishop of Lindisfarne, the sacred heart of Northumbrian Christianity. The island monastery, founded 158 years earlier, was home to the shrine of Saint Cuthbert, the most venerated saint in northern England. Pilgrims came from across the kingdom to pray at his tomb. The monastery's scriptorium had produced the Lindisfarne Gospels, a masterpiece of illuminated manuscript. The church's altars were laden with silver chalices, gold reliquaries, and precious jewels donated by kings and nobles. It was, as the scholar Alcuin would later write, a place more venerable than all in Britain. And the decision the raiders made that morning would trigger an attack so brutal, so unprecedented, that it would be remembered as the first blow of the Viking Age, an era that would reshape Europe for the next 3 centuries. Before the story continues, a note on our mission. This narrative is a 100% fact-checked account based on hours of research into primary historical sources, including the Anglo-Saxon Chronicle, the letters of Alcuin of York written to King Ethelred of Northumbria and Bishop Higbald of Lindisfarne, and the chronicles compiled by later medieval historians drawing from earlier records. The visuals you are seeing are atmospheric. They are not a literal recreation, but are designed to create a mood, a historical audiobook with visual accompaniment. If you believe true stories are more powerful than fiction, please support our mission of telling them by liking and subscribing. Now, the story continues. Lindisfarne was not just any monastery. To understand the scale of what was about to happen, you need to understand what this place meant to the people of Northumbria in 793. The island itself was a tidal sanctuary, cut off from the mainland twice a day when the North Sea surged across the causeway. This isolation made it perfect for the contemplative life of monks, but it also made it vulnerable. There were no soldiers garrisoned here, no fortified walls thick enough to withstand a siege. The monks had never needed them. For over a century and a half, Lindisfarne had been a place of peace. The monastery had been founded in 635 by Saint Aidan, an Irish monk summoned from the island of Iona by King Oswald of Northumbria to serve as bishop. Aidan chose Lindisfarne specifically because of its remoteness. From this base, Celtic Christianity spread across the pagan kingdoms of northern England. The monastery became a center of learning, where monks copied sacred texts, studied theology, and trained missionaries. But it was Saint Cuthbert who made Lindisfarne truly sacred. Cuthbert had arrived at the monastery sometime in the 670s, a former shepherd turned monk who had already built a reputation as a miracle worker. He served as prior of Lindisfarne, reforming the community to follow Roman rather than Celtic customs after the Synod of Whitby in 664. The change was controversial, creating tensions among monks loyal to their Irish traditions. Seeking solitude, Cuthbert retreated to become a hermit on the remote Inner Farne Islands. But in 685, King Egfrith of Northumbria personally begged him to become Bishop of Lindisfarne. Cuthbert reluctantly accepted, and served for 2 years before his death in 687. What happened next cemented Lindisfarne's place in Christian history. 11 years after Cuthbert's burial, the monks opened his tomb to move his remains. They found his body completely uncorrupted, preserved as if he had died only days before. The church declared it a miracle. Cuthbert was venerated as a saint, and his tomb became one of the most important pilgrimage sites in England. Kings and nobles made the journey to pray for his intercession. They brought gifts: silver, gold, jeweled reliquaries, illuminated manuscripts. The monastery grew wealthy. By 793, Lindisfarne was home to perhaps 80 to 100 monks. Their days followed a rigid schedule. They woke before dawn for the first prayers, gathered 7 times throughout the day for communal worship, spent hours copying manuscripts in the scriptorium, tended gardens and livestock, and fished the waters around the island. They lived simply, sleeping in small cells, eating bread, fish, and vegetables. But the church itself was anything but simple. The altar glittered with treasures. The shrine of Saint Cuthbert was adorned with gold and precious stones. The monks were not warriors. They carried no weapons. Many had taken vows of non-violence. Their defense was their faith, and the belief that God, through Saint Cuthbert, would protect them. The monastery had never been attacked. The concept of a raid from the sea was almost incomprehensible. As Alcuin would later write in his letters, it was not thought that such an inroad from the sea could be made. The year 793 itself had been strange. The Anglo-Saxon Chronicle records that the first months were marked by terrifying omens. Witnesses reported immense whirlwinds tearing across the Northumbrian countryside. Flashes of lightning split the sky even on clear days. Most disturbing were reports of fiery dragons flying through the air. Modern historians theorize these may have been unusually bright meteor showers or aurora borealis, but to the people of the time, they were signs of divine anger. A great famine followed the portents. Crops failed. People starved. There was also political turmoil. Just months before, in February 793, a nobleman named Sigurd had died, reportedly by his own hand. Sigurd had led the conspiracy that murdered King Ælfwold of Northumbria in 788. In April, just 6 weeks before the raid, Sigurd's body had been brought to Lindisfarne for burial. A regicide and a suicide, buried in the sacred ground of Saint Cuthbert. Some, like Alcuin, would later wonder if this was the sin that brought down God's wrath. But on the morning of June 8, 793, Bishop Higbald and his monks knew none of this. They simply went about their daily routines, praying, working, living lives of devotion in one of the holiest places in Christendom. The morning was calm. The sea was grey. And somewhere beyond the horizon, dragon-prowed ships were cutting through the waves toward them. The first sign came from the sea. A fisherman, one of the laymen who lived near the monastery and supplied the monks with fish, saw them first. 3 ships, maybe 4. They were still far out, dark shapes moving swiftly across the water. But something about them was wrong. They were too fast. Their silhouettes were unfamiliar, long and narrow, with high prows that curved upward like the necks of serpents. The fisherman ran toward the monastery, shouting a warning. By the time he reached the gates, others had seen them too. Monks emerged from the scriptorium, from the church, from the gardens. They gathered on the shore, shielding their eyes against the morning light, watching the ships approach. These were Viking longships. Though the monks of Lindisfarne had no name for them yet, these vessels represented the cutting edge of 8th century naval technology. Built using clinker construction, with overlapping oak planks held together by iron rivets, they were both strong and flexible, able to withstand the brutal waves of the North Sea. Their most crucial feature was their shallow draft. Drawing less than 3 feet of water when fully loaded, they could navigate rivers, slip into coastal inlets, and beach directly on shore without needing a port. The longships that approached Lindisfarne that morning could have held 30 to 40 warriors each. They were propelled by both sail and oar. The square sails, woven from wool, had been lowered as the ships neared the coast, making them less visible from shore. Now the crews rowed, their oars striking the water in perfect rhythm, driving the ships forward at 6 knots. The raiders were Norsemen, likely from Norway or Denmark. Historical sources do not record their names or their exact place of origin, but we know from archaeological evidence and later accounts that by the late 8th century, Scandinavian shipbuilders had developed these longships specifically for raiding. The shallow draft allowed them to strike anywhere along a coastline and escape before defenders could respond. The symmetrical bow and stern meant they could reverse direction without turning around, crucial for quick getaways. The monks of Lindisfarne had no concept of what was coming. This was not the first Viking raid on the British Isles. 6 years earlier, in 787, 3 ships from Norway had landed on the coast of Wessex near Portland. When a local reeve, a royal official, rode to meet them and demand they report to the king, the Norsemen killed him. It was the first recorded Viking attack in England. In 792, just a year before Lindisfarne, King Offa of Mercia had begun organizing coastal defenses in Kent against pagan seamen. But news traveled slowly in the 8th century. The monks on their remote island had heard nothing of these incidents. As the longships drove onto the beach, grinding against the pebbles and sand, the monks finally understood. These were not traders, not pilgrims. The men who leaped from the ships wore leather tunics, and some wore chainmail. They carried round wooden shields painted with geometric designs. Their weapons were iron axes, long swords, and spears. The Vikings had chosen their target with either extraordinary luck or careful planning. Lindisfarne was wealthy, isolated, and completely undefended. It sat just 6 miles from the royal stronghold at Bamborough, but the monastery was cut off by the tide. Even if someone could escape to raise the alarm, no army could cross the causeway until the waters receded. The raiders had perhaps 6 hours before they needed to leave. The attack was swift and methodical. The Vikings spread out across the monastery grounds. Some headed directly for the church where the treasures were kept. Others rounded up the monks. There was no battle because there were no warriors to fight them. The monks were scholars, scribes, farmers. Some tried to run. Others fell to their knees in prayer, believing that divine intervention would save them. It did not. The raiders tore through the monastery like a storm. They smashed the doors of the church. Inside they found exactly what they had come for. The altar was stripped of its silver chalices and gold candlesticks. The shrine of Saint Cuthbert was desecrated, its reliquaries pried open and looted. They dug up the altar itself, searching for hidden treasures beneath. The illuminated manuscripts, priceless works of art, were scattered across the floor, trampled underfoot in the search for precious metals. And then came the violence. Some monks were killed outright, cut down as they tried to flee or defend the sacred space. Others were beaten. Many were stripped naked, humiliated, and driven out of the monastery at sword point. Some were taken in chains to the ships. These would be sold as slaves in Scandinavian markets or held for ransom. Contemporary sources suggest that children were among those taken. and some monks, according to one account, were drowned in the sea. The Anglo-Saxon Chronicle would later record it simply, "The harrowing inroads of heathen men made lamentable havoc in the Church of God in Holy Island, by rapine and slaughter." There was no hero at Lindisfarne that day, no warrior who made a stand, no tactical genius who saved the monastery. This was not that kind of story. The pivot, the moment that changed everything, was the decision the Vikings made when they chose this target. It was calculated, deliberate, and it would reverberate across Europe for centuries. Why Lindisfarne? The evidence suggests this was not a random raid. Some historians believe the Vikings had prior knowledge of the British coastline. Bone isotope analysis of pre-793 burials at Bamborough, the royal stronghold just down the coast from Lindisfarne, shows evidence of Scandinavian presence in the region before the raid. These were people who knew the seascape, the tides, the locations of wealthy targets. As one scholar notes, they were not just people who set out one day from Oslo and rode west until they hit something. They understood this North Sea world. The Vikings knew what they would find at Lindisfarne. Monasteries were perfect targets for early raids. They were wealthy, filled with precious metals used in religious ceremonies. They were isolated, often built on islands or remote peninsulas to provide contemplative solitude for monks. And crucially, they were undefended. Christian monasteries had no warriors, no walls strong enough to repel determined attackers. The monks' only protection was their sacred status. But the pagans did not care about Christian sanctity. To them, these were simply repositories of silver and gold, guarded by unarmed men who could be easily overpowered. The Vikings were not motivated by religious hatred. They were motivated by economics. Silver was currency in Scandinavia, used to buy land, pay dowries for marriage, and establish social status. A successful raid could make a man wealthy enough to settle down as a respected farmer or trader. The decision to attack Lindisfarne specifically was brilliant in its cruelty. By targeting the most sacred site in Northumbria, home to the shrine of Saint Cuthbert, the most beloved saint in northern England, the Vikings demonstrated that nowhere was safe. If God would not protect his own house, if Saint Cuthbert could not defend his own monks, then what hope did any Christian community have? The psychological impact was immediate and devastating. News of the raid traveled fast. Within weeks, word had reached Alcuin, a Northumbrian scholar who had been living at the court of Charlemagne in Francia, serving as tutor to the king's children. Alcuin was one of the leading intellectuals of the Carolingian Renaissance, a movement to preserve and advance learning in Christian Europe. He was hundreds of miles away when he heard what had happened to his homeland. His reaction was apocalyptic. In a series of letters written in the months following the raid, Alcuin expressed not just grief, but existential terror. He wrote to King Ethelred of Northumbria, "Never before has such terror appeared in Britain as we have now suffered from a pagan race, nor was it thought that such an inroad from the sea could be made." To Bishop Higbald, who had survived the raid, Alcuin wrote even more graphically, "Behold, the church of Saint Cuthbert spattered with the blood of the priests of God, despoiled of all its ornaments, a place more venerable than all in Britain, given as prey to pagan peoples." Alcuin struggled to understand why God had allowed this to happen. He concluded that it must be divine punishment for sin. Perhaps the murder of King Elfwald, or the burial of the regicide Sigga at Lindisfarne had brought down God's wrath. He urged the survivors to repent, to reform their lives, to prepare for even greater suffering. For Alcuin and many others, The raid on Lindisfarne was not just a crime. It was a sign of the end times. The Vikings, having loaded their ships with treasure and captives, sailed away. The entire raid had lasted perhaps a few hours. By the time help could have arrived from Bamborough, they were gone, vanished back into the North Sea as suddenly as they had appeared. The attack itself was over quickly, but the ordeal for the monks of Lindisfarne had only begun. As the dragon ships disappeared over the horizon, the survivors emerged from hiding to survey the devastation. The church of Saint Cuthbert was in ruins. The doors had been smashed open. Inside, the floor was littered with torn vestments, broken reliquaries, and scattered pages from illuminated manuscripts. The altar had been desecrated, dug up by men searching for hidden treasures. The shrine of Saint Cuthbert, the holiest spot in all of Northumbria, had been stripped of its gold and jewels. Blood stained the stone floor where monks had been cut down trying to defend the sacred space. Outside, the scene was equally grim. Bodies lay in the courtyard and along the beach. Some monks had been killed trying to flee. Others had died attempting to hide in outbuildings or the scriptorium. The exact death toll is not recorded in contemporary sources, but the description suggests it was substantial. Alcuin's letters speak of blood spattered around the altar, and bodies trampled like dung in the street. The survivors faced a horrifying accounting. Many of their brothers were missing. Some had been taken alive, dragged in chains to the Viking ships. These captives faced an uncertain fate. Some might be ransomed back to their families or the church, if anyone had the wealth to pay. Others would be sold as slaves in Scandinavian markets. The Vikings operated an extensive slave trade, shipping human cargo from raids across Europe to buyers in Denmark, Norway, Sweden, and beyond. For a Christian monk, this was a fate worse than death. Separation from their community, forced labor in a pagan land, with no hope of ever returning home. Alcuin, writing from Francia, tried desperately to help. In his letters he mentioned attempting to raise ransoms to free captured monks. Whether he succeeded is unknown. The sources do not record what happened to those taken from Lindisfarne in chains. The physical destruction was overwhelming, but the psychological trauma was worse. The monks of Lindisfarne had believed their monastery was protected by divine power. Saint Cuthbert had performed miracles in life and continued to work wonders through his incorrupt body after death. How could God allow his own house to be violated? How could Cuthbert fail to protect his own people? This theological crisis consumed the survivors and the wider Christian community. Alcuin's letters obsessively circle back to this question. In one letter to Bishop Higbald, he writes with anguish, "What assurance is there for the churches of Britain, if Saint Cuthbert, with so great a number of saints, defends not his own?" The answer, in Alcuin's mind, could only be that the people had sinned grievously, and God had withdrawn his protection as punishment. He pointed to signs of moral decay among the Northumbrians. In his letter to King Aethelred, Alcuin criticized the fashion and behavior of the nobility. Consider the dress, the way of wearing the hair, the luxurious habits of the princes and people. Look at your trimming of beard and hair, in which you have wished to resemble the pagans. Are you not menaced by terror of them whose fashion you wished to follow? This passage is fascinating because it suggests that even before the raids, there had been cultural contact between Scandinavians and Anglo-Saxons. The Northumbrians had adopted Viking hairstyles and dress. Alcuin saw this as evidence of spiritual corruption that had invited divine retribution. He also criticized the monks themselves. In a letter to Bishop Higbald, Alcuin wrote, "Do not in drunkenness blot out the words of your prayers. Do not go out after luxuries of the flesh and worldly avarice, but continue steadfastly in the service of God and in the discipline of the regular life. Whether these criticisms were fair or simply Alcuin's attempt to make sense of a senseless tragedy is unclear. What is certain is that the raid on Lindisfarne shattered the spiritual confidence of Christian England. The survivors faced immediate practical challenges. They had to bury their dead, tend to the wounded, and somehow rebuild their shattered community. The monastery's wealth had been stripped away. The treasures that pilgrims had donated over decades were gone. The church needed repairs. Food stores had been raided. Yet remarkably, the community endured. Within weeks or months, some semblance of normal monastic life resumed. The monks cleared the debris, repaired what they could, and returned to their routines of prayer and labor. The Lindisfarne Gospels, the masterpiece illuminated manuscript created between 710 and 725, survived the raid. It was either hidden successfully or deemed worthless by raiders searching only for precious metals. Today it resides in the British Library, one of the great treasures of early medieval art. The survival of the monastery is evidenced by the Doomsday Stone, a carved grave marker created in the 9th century and discovered at Lindisfarne during excavations in the late 19th century. One side depicts 7 uniformed warriors brandishing axes and swords, clearly Viking raiders. The other side shows a symbolic depiction of the Christian Day of Judgment, with Christ sitting in judgment over the sins of men. The stone served both as a memorial to the raid and a reminder that divine justice would ultimately prevail. But the trauma lingered. The raid on Lindisfarne was not an isolated incident. It was the beginning of a pattern that would continue for decades. In 794, just a year later, Vikings attacked the monastery at Jarrow, where the Venerable Bede had composed his ecclesiastical history of the English people. In 795, they raided the monastery at Iona on the west coast of Scotland, the mother house from which St. Aidan had come to found Lindisfarne. Iona was raided again in 802 and 806, the second attack so devastating that it was recorded. The Vikings burned and demolished, killed abbot and monks and all that they found there, brought it about so that what was earlier very rich was, as it were, nothing. The pattern was clear. Wealthy, isolated monasteries were prime targets. The Vikings could strike with impunity, load their ships with treasure and slaves, and vanish before any military response could be organized. Coastal defenses had to be reorganized. Monasteries built watchtowers and early warning systems. Some communities relocated inland, abandoning their vulnerable coastal locations. The psychological warfare was as effective as the physical destruction. The sight of dragon-prowed longships on the horizon became a symbol of terror throughout Christian Europe. Monks in monasteries from Ireland to Francia lived in fear of the next raid. Chronicles record prayers being added to church services. From the fury of the Northmen, O Lord, deliver us. For the survivors at Lindisfarne, the summer of 793 must have felt endless. Every day brought the fear that the ships would return. Every sail on the horizon caused panic. The monks who had lost brothers, who had witnessed the desecration of their sacred shrine, who had seen their world shattered by violence they could not comprehend, had to find a way to continue living. They did continue. Against all odds, the monastery survived. The cult of Saint Cuthbert grew even stronger. Within a generation, Lindisfarne would be rebuilt and flourishing again. But it would never be the same. The age of innocence, The belief that monasteries were sanctuaries protected by God from worldly violence had ended forever on June 8, 793. The darkest moment for Lindisfarne and for Christian Europe came not during the raid itself, but in the hours and days that followed, as the full scope of the catastrophe became clear. As the tide went out and the causeway to the mainland became passable, riders from Bamborough finally arrived. They found a scene of utter devastation. The church was in ruins. Blood and bodies littered the monastery grounds. Survivors huddled together, traumatized and in shock. Many monks were missing, either dead or taken as slaves. The shrine of Saint Cuthbert, the holiest site in Northumbria, had been ransacked and defiled. For the kingdom of Northumbria, this was a political as well as spiritual disaster. The royal stronghold at Bamborough was only 6 miles away. How could King Ethelred explain that he had failed to protect the most sacred place in his realm? The raid exposed the weakness of coastal defenses and the vulnerability of isolated communities to seaborne attacks. For the Church, the theological implications were devastating. The belief that monasteries were protected by divine power had been the foundation of monastic life for centuries. If God would not defend his own house, if prayers and sanctity offered no protection against pagan violence, then what was the point of the monastic vocation? Why live lives of poverty and devotion if such holiness could be violated by men who worshipped false gods? The climax of this crisis came when news reached the continent. Alcuin received reports of the raid while serving at Charlemagne's court in Aachen. His reaction was immediate and visceral. Within weeks, he had written multiple letters to Northumbrian leaders, each more anguished than the last. To King Ethelred, Alcuin wrote with barely controlled panic. He described the raid as an unprecedented catastrophe, something that had never been seen before in Britain's 350-year history as a Christian land. He begged the king to consider what sins had brought down such divine punishment. He urged moral reform, repentance, and preparation for even worse to come. To Archbishop Ethelhard of Canterbury, he wrote warning that Lindisfarne might be only the beginning. If the northernmost, most sacred site in Britain could be destroyed, what would stop the pagans from raiding the rest of the island? This is the beginning of greater suffering, he wrote. To Bishop Higbald, who had survived the raid and was trying to rebuild his devastated community, Alcuin wrote with compassion and urgency. He acknowledged the bishop's grief and trauma. He tried to raise ransoms for captured monks. He offered spiritual counsel, urging the survivors to see the raid as a test of faith that must be endured. But it was in Alcuin's poem, De Clade Lindisfarnensis Monasterii, or On the Destruction of the Monastery of Lindisfarne, that his true feelings poured out. Written in Latin verse, the poem describes the desecration in graphic detail. The blood of priests spattered on the altar, the bodies of saints trampled underfoot, the pagans despoiling sacred ornaments while showing no mercy to age or innocence. The poem was copied and distributed across Christian Europe. It became one of the defining texts of the early Viking Age, shaping how generations of Christians would understand and remember the raid on Lindisfarne. The climax of the actual attack had been brief and brutal, but the climax of its impact on Christian consciousness was this moment, when Alcuin and others realized that the world had changed forever. The relative peace and security that Christian Europe had enjoyed for generations was over. A new kind of warfare had begun, one that struck from the sea without warning, targeted the most sacred sites, and showed no respect for Christian sanctity. The factual result of the raid can be stated simply. An unknown number of monks were killed, likely dozens. Many more were taken as slaves, their ultimate fates unrecorded. The monastery was severely damaged but not destroyed. Its treasures were looted, but some artifacts survived, including the Lindisfarne Gospels. The physical destruction was significant but repairable. The psychological and spiritual damage was far worse, and would never be fully repaired. The raid on Lindisfarne marked the beginning of the Viking Age, a period that would last until the Norman conquest in 1066. Over those 3 centuries, Scandinavian raiders, traders, and settlers would reshape the British Isles, Ireland, Francia, and beyond. They would establish the Danelaw in England, found Dublin in Ireland, and create the Duchy of Normandy in France. Their descendants would go on to conquer England and southern Italy, explore the Atlantic, and reach North America. All of it began with dragon ships on the beach at Lindisfarne, on a gray morning in June, 793. The climax was not a heroic stand or a miraculous deliverance. It was the realization by Alcuin and others that this attack was not an aberration, but a sign of things to come. It was the moment when medieval Europe understood that a new age had dawned, and it would be written in blood and fire. The immediate aftermath of the raid saw the monks of Lindisfarne struggling to rebuild their shattered community. Bishop Higbold led the effort to restore the church, bury the dead, and resume some semblance of monastic life. The monastery survived, and over the following decades it even flourished again, though it would never fully recover its pre-793 prominence. The cult of Saint Cuthbert continued and actually grew stronger. The fact that the monastery had been attacked raised theological questions, but it did not diminish Cuthbert's reputation as a miracle worker and intercessor. Pilgrims still came to pray at his shrine. Kings still sought his blessing. The saint remained the patron of Northumbria. But the Vikings returned. They raided Lindisfarne again and again over the following decades. By 875, the threat had become so severe that the monks made a drastic decision. They would abandon the island entirely. In a scene both poignant and practical, they exhumed the body of Saint Cuthbert from his tomb, placed it in a portable wooden coffin, and fled inland. Thus began an extraordinary 200-year journey. The monks carried Cuthbert's body across Northumbria, seeking a safe haven. They stopped first at Chester Street, where they established a temporary community. They stayed there for over a century. Finally, in 995, they moved to Durham, where they built a new church to house the saints' remains. That church would eventually become Durham Cathedral, one of the greatest achievements of Norman Romanesque architecture. St. Cuthbert's tomb remains there today, still a site of pilgrimage. The Viking raids that began at Lindisfarne fundamentally changed how monasteries operated. No longer could they rely solely on divine protection. Coastal communities built defensive structures. Watchtowers were erected to give early warning of approaching ships. Some monasteries relocated inland, abandoning their traditional island sanctuaries. The church had to adapt to a world where sacred space could be violated by military force. For Christian Europe more broadly, the raid on Lindisfarne became a defining moment. It marked the transition from the relatively peaceful early medieval period to the turbulent Viking Age. The image of dragon ships appearing on the horizon became synonymous with terror and destruction. The phrase, "From the fury of the Northmen, O Lord, deliver us," became a common prayer throughout Christian lands. Modern historians recognize June 8, 793, as the symbolic beginning of the Viking Age. While earlier raids had occurred, Lindisfarne was the first to shock all of Christian Europe. It demonstrated the vulnerability of coastal communities to seaborne attacks. It proved that the Vikings possessed both the naval technology and the ruthlessness to strike anywhere they chose. The long-term legacy extends far beyond the immediate damage. The Viking Age that began at Lindisfarne would reshape the political map of Europe. Scandinavian raiders would evolve into traders and settlers. They would establish kingdoms in England, Ireland, and Normandy. Their cultural influence would spread across the continent. The raid also had a profound impact on historical consciousness. The letters of Alcuin, written in the immediate aftermath, became some of the most important contemporary sources for understanding not just the event itself, but the medieval Christian worldview. His anguished questions about why God allowed the raid to happen reveal how deeply the attack challenged fundamental beliefs about divine protection and sacred space. The Doomsday Stone, carved by 9th-century monks at Lindisfarne, stands as a permanent memorial to the raid. On one side, the 7 warriors with their axes and swords. On the other, the promise of divine judgment. The stone embodies the medieval Christian response to Viking violence. Acknowledgement of earthly suffering, combined with faith in ultimate, heavenly justice. Lindisfarne itself never regained its former glory. After the monks fled in 875, the island remained largely abandoned for over 2 centuries. Following the Norman conquest, a new priory was established on the site in the 12th century, built on the ruins of the Anglo-Saxon monastery. Those ruins, maintained today by English Heritage, are what visitors see when they walk across the causeway to Holy Island. The raid on Lindisfarne teaches us something fundamental about historical turning points. Often, the events that change history most profoundly are not massive battles or political revolutions, but small, brutal acts that shatter existing assumptions about how the world works. A few hours of violence on a remote island in June 793 marked the beginning of an age. The story of Lindisfarne is not about heroism in the conventional sense. There was no warrior who made a desperate last stand, no tactical genius who outsmarted the enemy, no miraculous intervention that saved the day. The monks were scholars and holy men who faced an enemy they could not fight and a form of warfare they could not comprehend. But there is a different kind of courage in how they responded. The survivors rebuilt. They carried on their mission of prayer and learning. They preserved sacred texts and traditions through decades of uncertainty and fear. When they finally had to abandon the island, they did not abandon their faith. They carried Saint Cuthbert's body on a 2-century journey that ended at Durham, where the saint's legacy continues to this day. The raid on Lindisfarne changed Europe forever. It marked the beginning of the Viking Age, an era that would reshape kingdoms, cultures, and the map of the medieval world. It proved that no place was too sacred, no location too remote, to be beyond the reach of determined raiders in fast ships. The story of those monks on June 8, 793, deserves to be told and remembered. It is a story of faith tested by violence, of communities destroyed and rebuilt, of how a single day of terror can echo through centuries. Please like, subscribe, and comment below with other forgotten medieval stories you would like to see told. If you believe that true history is more powerful than fiction, help us continue this mission of bringing these stories to light.